Thank you for joining us for this webinar on domestic violence in Indigenous communities. On behalf of the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family, I would like to welcome our speaker, Lynette Grable.
Thank you, Galen, for that introduction. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. We're going to cover domestic violence in Indigenous communities today. I will go in depth on each slide and go and elaborate as we move along. I wanted to thank everybody for joining in. Every time I do a presentation, I always like to introduce myself, give you just a slight background of myself and my work. My name is Lynette Grable. I am full-blooded Native American. I am both Hunkapaw Lakota and also Northern Arapaho from the Wind River Reservation. And I did a lot of advocacy work in Arizona for about 11 years. I now reside here at the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. But a lot of the work that I did was around sexual assault prevention, domestic violence education, along with human trafficking in Indian country and missing murdered Indigenous women and girls movement. I have my own nonprofit. It's called Not Our Native Daughters. I'm a mother of 3 beautiful children, and I do a lot of child advocacy work as well. But I started Not Our Native Daughters specifically to advocate for the issues that we face in Indian country. And one of the things that I always say when I present is that I stand before you as a full-blooded Native American woman, and the statistic that hangs over my head is that I am the most stalked, raped, murdered, sexually assaulted, and I suffer domestic violence 50 times higher than the national average. This is the core reason why I started Not Our Native Daughters, to change the statistics. There's a lot of factors that go into why that we have these statistics. I will cover some of them today. But it's something that I've committed my life to trying to change that statistic, not just for myself, but, you know, like the name of my organization is, you know, I think of all Indigenous women and girls as my daughters. And so not my daughter, not your daughter, or not our daughters. And so some of the presentation overview that we'll be going over first is the National Coalition of Domestic Violence, specifically for Arizona statistics, and then we'll get into violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women, and that is by the NCAI, the National Committee of American Indians. Most of us have a basic knowledge of what domestic violence is. Domestic violence is a willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or other abusive behavior as part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. It includes physical violence, sexual violence, threats, and emotional abuse. The frequency and severity of domestic violence can vary dramatically. 46.6% of Arizona women and 33% of Arizona men experience intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and or intimate partner stalking. An estimated 304,000 American women, Arizona women, have experienced stalking by an intimate partner. I think that's kind of startling as we think about just the community and citizens of Arizona. I believe that is a high number. A 2019 one-day snapshot found that Arizona domestic violence programs served about 1,539 on just one day. There were 96 domestic violence related deaths in Arizona in the year 2019. In 2017, Arizona ranked 7th in the nation in homicides per capita. As of December 31st of 2019, just roughly a year ago, Arizona had submitted 3 misdemeanor domestic violence records and no active protective order records to the NICS index. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. On a typical day, local domestic violence hotlines receive approximately 19,159 calls. an average of approximately 13 calls every minute. In 2018, domestic violence accounted for about 20% of all violent crime. Abusers' access to firearms increase risk of intimate partner femicide at least 5-fold. Homicide, when firearms have been used in the most severe abuse incidences, the risk increases about 41-fold. 65% of all murder-suicides involve an intimate partner-related death. 96% of victims of these crimes are female. Domestic violence related firearms laws in Arizona, domestic violence and dating violence misdemeanors in Arizona are prohibited from possessing firearms while on probation. Judges are authorized but not required to prohibit respondents to ex parte and final protective orders, including dating violence orders, from having firearms. The last two are respondents subject to final protective orders prohibiting firearms possession are required to surrender their firearms. Law enforcement is authorized but not required to confiscate firearms when responding to domestic violence calls. As you can see, some of these statistics and data that I mentioned, I mean, these are really important when we talk about protecting women, especially violence against women, domestic violence against women, because some of these, you know, in the realm of justice, in the realm of law, there's not always a requirement to, you know, handle a situation where firearms can be removed. It's sometimes the law enforcement or the judge's call, but you know, when we see escalated cases of domestic violence escalate to, unfortunately, to a death or a murder, oftentimes in those cases, we look at some of those domestic violence cases, the most extreme ones, and we see that where the incidents it could have been probably, possibly, you know, stopped by actually having some of the firearms removed in the home when they were known to be in the home. So Arizona can strengthen its laws to protect victims and survivors by prohibiting domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking misdemeanants from possessing firearms unless they have their records expunged or pardoned, or otherwise have their civil rights restored. Prohibiting respondents to ex parte and final protective orders from possessing firearms, requiring persons prohibited due to domestic violence to relinquish any firearms in their possession. So this is kind of a snapshot of what data has been pulled from the state of Arizona quite recently, from just last year. And these are the things that could do a little step forward to protect women in Arizona. I'm going to go a little bit into depth about the Indigenous community when it comes to domestic violence. Native American women, as I stated before, experience domestic violence 50 times higher than a national average. Arizona holds about 26 different tribes in the state. So we have both, Arizona both has a high population in the urban region in Maricopa County, as long as, you know, the other counties surrounding this throughout the state. So this is really important for Arizona, especially for those who work in this field, because I think domestic violence tends to be a little bit different in tribal communities. And so domestic violence and intimate partner violence occurs in all communities. However, various causes and affect the level, intensity, and prevalence of violence. Studies indicate that violence against women, including domestic abuse and sexual assault, is higher among Native American communities. So most of us who work in this realm understand the power control wheel. I like this, another idea of power control. And this was made by the Duluth Model Organization in Minnesota. Like I stated before, I think that when Native women suffer violence of any kind, especially domestic violence in tribal communities, it's a lot different than it is in an urban region or outside of the reservation bubble, as I say, is because there's different factors for us. One of the huge factors for us is the cultural aspect of what we have in our Indigenous heritage. You have to imagine there's about 574 tribes throughout the whole nation, and throughout the 574 tribes, federally recognized tribes in our nation, we all have our own ceremonies, we have our own rituals, we have our own protocols that we follow within our reservation and within our community. And so we hold those ceremonies and these things that we practice as Indigenous people to a really high standard. So not only do we have like a kind of like a government, so to speak, within our own reservation and tribe, but we also have a ceremonial hierarchy that is strictly followed within our tribe. Most tribes, when they have ceremonies during their times of ritual and time of fasting and just putting time aside for these ceremonial events, we shut down our whole entire tribe. Our offices close. We practice our religious ways, and so in that, that is also kind of a factor, especially when it comes to Native American victims and domestic violence, both by if it's both by a Native American perpetrator. So this cultural will explains different abuse of the Native American victims' experience in their relationships. It kind of outlines and shows that sometimes abuse can isolate the victims from the community and harms their emotions. Families are shaped by certain rules that in turn are driven by cultural beliefs. In light of the importance of cultural and spirituality to Native Americans' identities, cultural abuse can be severe, disruptive to victims' well-being. In abusive situations, the perpetrators might belittle survivors' traditions, practices, and beliefs. I have several years ago used to work in direct services, and one of the kind of the common things that I would see is, especially when it was somebody who was a Native woman who resided on the reservation, sometimes the perpetrator were in these ceremonial and religious hierarchies. And part of the problem was that some of the victims chose not to identify their perpetrator, or they didn't want to say their name, or they didn't want to go on record with law enforcement or the courts. And part of that is because they didn't want to get alienated from their own tribe. Sometimes when allegations are made by perpetrators and they're in the ceremonial and cultural hierarchy, it can be very hard to make that make your voice be heard in that, because not only are you already feeling the victimization, the shame of the entire ordeal, and I just want to highlight too, I'm a domestic violence survivor, so I kind of identify of a victim's mindset, being a domestic violence survivor, and so there's a lot emotionally to deal with, and then you have the trauma, and then on top of the trauma you have this cultural hierarchy that sometimes you do not want to come against. Only because you have to think about your family's position within the tribe, but also, not trying to be alienated from your own family and your own people and community. So in terms of victimization of any sort, especially for Indigenous women, because we're typically the targets, it's really hard for domestic violence survivors or a victim of any violent crime to come out and step forward and really get the justice they need because of these different cultural aspects of how we live our life. In order to end domestic violence in all its forms, we must understand why it exists in Indigenous communities today, and assess our current challenges in addressing the issue. When we examine the reasons behind the presence of domestic violence in Native communities, we must first consider its historical origins. Domestic violence in Native society came about over the course of centuries of change, examining the history of oppression that laid the groundwork for the rise of violence against Native women shows us that efforts to end the domestic violence faced by women across Indian country today are still in their infancy. You know, when I say it's still in their infancy, it's really a true statement because, you know, from somebody, I lived, you know, both on and off the reservation. And so, you know, both in the urban settings across our nation, we have great support. You know, there's resources there. If there's ever, you know, a domestic violence situation where they can reach out to the community, they can reach out to probably get adequate response from law enforcement, get adequate response from, you know, medical, if they need medical attention. And sometimes that's not always true if that scenario plays out in Indian country. And so most of the reservations that I've visited, you know, most of them, I would say probably at least 70% of those reservations do not have domestic violence or even sexual assault resources or support. So meaning if they're in a situation where they need to escape a violent home or a violent situation, they don't have the resources to do that. Most of the sexual assault or domestic violence victims that I worked with in reservations, they had to go somewhere outside of the reservation to seek the help that they needed. And most times it was far away from their own home. It could be hours away from where they're from, only because the resources is afar, or most often the towns or cities that border the reservation, they're at full capacity and they are placed somewhere even farther. I've even worked with Native American victims who were placed out of state. They had to go to a whole different state just to get a place for them and their children to live. So, you know, as far as domestic violence resources, you know, adequacy to have a safe place for domestic violence victims to go, it's really still in the infancy stages. In reference to Indian country, because the resources are just not there. So contributing factors, majority of reservations are in remote or vast rural regions. You know, most of the tribes, you know, Maricopa, Gila River, you know, Salt River that are within our Maricopa County area, you know, they have the luxury of being in an urban region. And that's great, especially if there are situations of where women need to seek help right away or quickly. However, if you move up north, you'll see, like in parts of the Navajo Nation, White Mountain Apache, and the other Apache tribes. If you go down south to Yavapai, Pasquale, to Otoonum, some of those are in remote areas. And this is true just all across Indian country in general. Most of reservations are in very rural regions. Usually takes about 2 to 3 hours just to get to the closest town or city. Most of us make that long drive so that we can shop and get the things that we need for our homes. But you know, it is most of Indian country across the nation live in rural, vast regions. And this is also a factor when it comes to domestic violence and victims who need the help. Lack of resources and funding to promote education, empowerment, awareness, and prevention. Again, this is another core value of Not Our Native Daughters, is because I wanted to make it accessible for Indian country, accessible for social services, and even law enforcement to get that training, to get that understanding. Lack of domestic violence shelters, outsider perception of Native American reservations. This is really important because I used to work for Department of Justice, and part of my work with them was in creating and presenting and training and even advising on how to train law enforcement from all different levels to how to respond to Indian country, especially when it came to violence that occurred or federal crimes that would occur within Indian country. And a lot of that perceptions had to be kind of talked about. The myths, some of the myths that are out there that, that we're all drunks or we're all poor. And, even though those are true, and some reservations see that more than others. The reality is, regardless of whatever the myth is about Native Americans or the perception about Native Americans or Native American communities, the ideal is that we have to be able, as a public servant, we have to be able to serve every person in a fair and just manner. So there's a lot of undoing, I think, sometimes when we talk about public social services, and even just, relationships from tribes to tribal government to government relationships from both tribal leaders, tribes, to the federal level and the state level. Sometimes there's a lot of bridge making that needs to be done. I focus a lot on that. I focus on a lot of making bridge making, a lot of everybody coming to the table. And sometimes a lot of more work can be done when that understanding is there. So another contributing factors are historical trauma patterns associated with boarding schools. Native American communities have high levels of trauma. One of the things I always say is, like, I personally never went to boarding school, but my parents did and my grandparents did. And so I never suffered the violence or the trauma of being away from my family, 10 months out of the year. But, I have the passed down trauma. I have the associate trauma because my parents had the trauma of boarding school, and so did my grandparents. And so, speaking about historical trauma, I think some people might think, oh, you're just trying to blame, white America about, this is what you did to us. And that's not really the issue. Well, it is in a sense, but the point of talking about historical trauma is to talk about the trauma that still resides in the present day. And that contributes to a lot of the violence that we see in tribal communities. The cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity, I think, is good, and I do cultural sensitivity training. My time with Department of Justice, there was many times we traveled to other tribal communities, reservations, a lot of reservations I had never even been to. But, as an Indigenous person, I understand the sensitivity of, respecting one another, how they see and relate to outsiders. And so some of the folks that came in, including myself, they kind of lack the understanding, lack the understanding of how the tribe works as far as what is honorable. We really do have an honor system. We really do have a level of integrity that we correspond with outsiders. And so some of that sometimes is good to get briefed on before you enter a reservation or work with a tribal community, because you want to make sure that you're not being disrespectful. I remember at the end of one of our trainings, the elder women of the community had handmade blankets, and for some of the other staff that had come, that came, and they were from a government office. But I know the rule is, especially with government, you're not allowed to accept gifts, and they had to turn away handmade blankets that were probably spent, I don't know, 30 hours to make. And it's for them, for that community, for that tribal community, they took it as a disrespect because the gifts were not accepted. And so I just think that when we come to a place of understanding and coming together, we can be a lot more cohesive working with tribal communities, because they have their own set of rules on how they deal with people and how they work with people. And we definitely, none of us have any intentions to, step on anybody's toes or be disrespectful, but it's good to understand how that tribe or how that culture works, and so that we can be respectful when we go to visit or work with those other tribes, Indigenous communities. Systemic oppression kind of correlates and with racism, institutionalized racism, systemic racism, and then of course just lack of urgent law enforcement and medical response. Now, I've seen this time and time again working with Native American victims. Unfortunately, there's different factors in that, and I'm not here to point who's wrong and who's right. However, in I would say in the defense, especially when it came to law enforcement, tribal communities, they work with very little funding to get the job done. So for example, like one of my tribes is the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. That tribe is the size of a state. It goes in both North Dakota and South Dakota. And years ago, you would be lucky to have 2 officers on staff at the same time. So most times there was only 1, sometimes 2 officers on call, at the same time, just due to funding, a lack of funding. And so situations like that, of cases that I'm aware of, women called, Native women called who lived on the reservation, called 911 for a domestic violence issue, and wasn't able to get responded to just because of lack of law enforcement response. Same is true with medical. Sometimes that could not, some people that reside on the reservation, they have to go to outside healthcare systems, and sometimes they're turned away, or they don't want to be seen, or they get minimal service because maybe lack of insurance, or lack of being able to pay for their medical attention. And again, I've seen these cases time and over again working with sexual assault victims from the reservation. Another contributing factor is that violent crime in Indian country is more than twice the national average. On some reservations, it's 20 times the national average. This is very important when it comes to the Not Invisible Act, Savannah's Act. But the Not Invisible Act that was recently passed is very important, something that I lobbied on. I lobbied on both Savannah's Act and I lobbied on the Not Invisible Act, solely because there's measures that I believe that needs to be in place on the federal level to help the tribal level of attacking the violent crime. Most of the violent crimes that happen in Indian country are not made by Native Americans. Or actually, the Department of Justice statistic is that 70% of perpetrators are non-Native that attack either Native women, men, or children. So the violent crime, I mean, some, again, we're talking about 574 different tribes. Some tribes don't see very little crime. And depending on where the location or the state, we'll see that some will have 20 times the national average. And then if you put in there, the lack of law enforcement, or the lack of, be able to get someone to respond, I mean, that contributes to those numbers. Another issue that we face of missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, or missing murdered Indigenous persons. Again, this goes right along with the violence that we see in Indian country that seems to be poorly addressed. It's my hope that with the Not Invisible Act and the Savannah's Act, and plenty of states like Arizona, Oklahoma, Washington, I know Wyoming, and some other great states have implemented task force. These are great ways to address the issue, both on a state level. I really do believe that the state level of addressing these issues is the way to go, not only because we don't want federal overreach, but I do believe each state is unique, and each tribes within their states are unique as well. There's no cookie cutter approach to addressing issues, but I think states have the hearts and minds and the expertise to handle an issue within their own state. And so I've advocated for 3 years for states to have a task force. I'm on my own task force here in the state of Wyoming, and I'm also on the Human Trafficking Task Force. And those task force really helps to get the ball rolling, and it gets everybody in social services at the same table. And they're able to pull from each other. They're able to share, intel that they probably cannot share in no other form or other meeting format. And so task forces on a state level is a really great way to address the issues and get everybody working together. Another factor that we see, and I thought it was important to mention, is human trafficking, or child sex trafficking. Child sex trafficking is very prevalent in Indian country. That's one of the top things that I train on. that and missing murdered Indigenous women and girls, and of course, sexual assault and domestic violence. But, one thing I always say, and this is true just anywhere around the world, anywhere where you see poverty or extreme poverty, you unfortunately will always find the selling of children. And so these are different factors that people that work with tribal communities or work in correlation with social services from tribal communities to understand, like the rates and the statistics that we face, not only as a nation, but within the tribal community as well. Like it was stated before, domestic violence and sexual assault against Indigenous women, I would say in any woman of any race, is not a new thing, right? We've seen violence against women for many years and even hundreds of years. But this was actually kind of investigated through some professors, that the selling of North American Indigenous women and children for sexual purposes has been an ongoing practice since the colonial era. There's evidence that early British surveyors and settlers viewed Native women's sexual and reproductive freedom as a proof of their innate impurity, and that many assumed the right to kidnap, rape, abuse, and prostitute Indigenous women and girls without consequences. It was a sign of that, they've conquered the land, they've conquered the people, do what you want with these women and children. And so this is something that's been ongoing for hundreds of years. It's not a new thing that we face as Indigenous people. I'm going to get into now the violence against American Indian and Alaskan Native statistics. This was quite recent in 2018. Most of us who work with data or research, we understand that data and research is only a snapshot of the problem. The numbers are typically even higher if we really got all the numbers from every nook and cranny. But as far as Native Americans go, more than 4 in 5 American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime, and that's at 84%. More than half of Indigenous women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime, and that's at 56%. 70% of violent victimizations experienced by American Indians are committed by persons not of the same race, a substantially higher rate of interracial violence than experienced by white or Black victims. So the statistic shows that, the violence experienced by Native American or Indigenous persons is 70% not committed by other Native Americans. They're made by other races. So as Indigenous people, we have the highest rate of interracial violence than any other race. More than half of Indigenous women have experienced physical violence by intimate partners in their lifetime at 55%. Almost half of Indigenous women have been stalked in their lifetime at 48%. I think all of these statistics are shocking and just profound, but it's, when we talk about stalking on a national level, when we talk about all women of color, the stalking rates are a little bit lower than we see on the other categories of violence. So this is always like so shocking to me when we see 48% of Indigenous women that are stalked. Indigenous women are 1.7 times more likely than white women to have experienced violence in the past. Native women are also face murder rates more than 10 times the national average in some counties. The murder rate of Indigenous women is almost 3 times that of a white woman. The vast majority of Indigenous female victims of sexual violence experience violence at the hands of non-perpetrators at 21%. Indigenous women were 5 times as likely to have experienced physical violence by the interracial or intimate partner versus white women at 90% versus 18%. So, I mean, that's to me is a huge contrast. We think of the white women compared to Indigenous women, we see 90% in the Indigenous women statistic versus 18% in white women. And so it kind of draws a picture of the rate of violence that we experience. Like I stated before, you know, I spend a lot of time advocating on these issues, both on a federal and state level, and both on a tribal level as well. You know, within my own community, I make sure that I educate the young ones, the high schoolers, even the middle school age group, but also just the social services level as well. It's important that we keep talking about these issues so that we can change them. You know, we really can't change them unless we talk about them. I always believe that that is the first step towards healing, is to address the issue and communicate it. And one of the kind of the Native American norms is to not talk about bad things. And so we have to get over, you know, kind of sweeping stuff under the rug, because as some of the statistics that I shared, you could see where it is actually detrimental in the long term of things, and just for good mental health and you know, a good way to kind of move forward is to address the issues that we face. There's a lot of other things, that rabbit holes that I could have went down, but you know, I wanted to make sure that I was able to get through the information in the PowerPoint and elaborate a little bit on each of them. But you know, one thing I always say is, you know, like myself, you know, I can't do it alone. We can't do it alone. I always encourage both tribal communities and the federal and state level to work with one another, come to the table of understanding, as I call it, and try to not only learn but grasp on how to handle the issue. And I think one of them is empowerment and education. I think that's always the first step. If any of you have questions or concerns or anything, feel free to contact me. I'm always available by email, and that is my cell phone number. Feel free to call or text me. I do believe that together, cohesively, we can change some of these statistics and make a better community for all of us. My name is Lynette Grable. I thank you so much for tuning in. I know I dumped a lot of information in your lap, but I thank you again for your attention to domestic violence in the country. I thank you.
Thank you, Lynette, for that. I really appreciate you developing this webinar to share with us. As a disclaimer for the Governor's Office, the views expressed in these presentations belong solely to the presenters, and they do not reflect the official policy or position of the Governor's Office of Youth, Faith, and Family. If you have any further questions or concerns about domestic violence, feel free to visit our website at itcanstop.az.gov. Thank you all.